I think I'm so excited by the topic of the panel, because I often think of global health and bioethics as these areas of study, disciplines, themes, all of that is quite contentious as well. We're in this real moment of contention, of disagreement, of hopefully transformation. Obviously, the last few years with the pandemic, but of course, the climate catastrophe, the economic hardships that we're seeing globally, technological innovation, and this big leap that we're having, or these conversations that we're having with AI, for example, they're all really underscoring the importance of global health and of bioethics, and of how inextricably linked these are. The inequalities, the inequities, the injustices that are persisting in our societies, and how they shape and affect not just people's healthcare access and their well-being, but can threaten their very survival. These aren't individual level issues that largely global health and sometimes bioethics has been the unit of analysis. But we're moving more towards the acknowledgement of how deeply structural these are, because fundamentally these are manifestations of power, right? Like how structures and societies, how coloniality, racism, sexism, forms of supremacy are really entrenched into the very bones and the fabric of society. So we can't really remove that from how we think of health, how we think of well-being, how we think of thriving. Obviously, this was abundantly clear during the pandemic, the disparity and inequity between countries, like who has the purchasing power to buy up ventilation, to ventilators, to buy up oxygen, and where does a concept like a lockdown, how does that manifest when home and shelter, those questions aren't taken for granted, right? That doesn't necessarily always exist in the same way as it might here in London. But we also saw how at the same time, with the scandal of expiring equipment, of vaccines expiring, of PPE equipment being thrown away, when many countries in the global south weren't even able to begin to purchase enough to cover major cities. And we saw it play out within countries too, right? So where we saw systemic racial inequities in healthcare. So when Black and brown people, and this was also very much gendered, as we saw in the UK, in the US, and along class or caste lines, or in other parts of the world, when they exposed and heightened amounts of risks, because they already, due to these systemic injustices, have poor access to vital resources like transportation or healthy foods or clean air. And these, as many scholars, including our esteemed panelists today, have pointed out, are about power imbalances between countries, within nations and communities, but they're also really reflective of epistemic injustice. Whose epistemologies, theories, principles, values, concepts are heard, whose knowledges are centered and valued or not. And global health and bioethics are both contending separately, and for those of us who sit at the intersections of it, all at once, with these increasingly urgent demands for decolonization, for contending with these epistemic injustices that are a feature, I think, not a bug of these disciplines. And this urgency is not just about the field or the disciplines, right? For me, I think it's about, what about our imaginations of what justice are? Who do these imaginations serve? Who do these ideas serve? And how might we actually work to transform not just our futures, but the possibilities of the present? And sometimes I think when we're discussing decolonization, it falls into this default of speaking only to power, of contending and challenging existing power inequities and existing power structures. But what might it look like to not just speak to power, but to speak amongst and between the South, between those who are made marginal? What might this look like, and what possibilities might that engender? What knowledges or epistemologies might this bring to shift and shape our disciplines, our spaces, our societies? And I think it offers really incredible possibilities and can be a really germinal space for us to think with. And I think this is why I'm so excited about what our panel will hopefully be touching on and sharing with us today. And so with that, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our panel and our panelists. We have first Caesar Atuire, who is a philosopher who works on the dialogue and overlaps between African and Euro-American philosophy at the University of Ghana and the University of Oxford. His research draws on various traditions of African philosophy to address global ethical issues, where he has worked on the frameworks informing the understanding of mental health in the African context, the principles surrounding research and healthcare ethics in a communitarian context, and how African conceptions of solidarity can contribute to conversations around the right to health and global health. He's also worked on models of decolonization and global health, and contributed to the conversation around Black Lives Matter and the removal of statues of racists from public spaces. In short, he is a philosopher who is concerned about ethics and frameworks of equity in the generation, dissemination, and sharing of knowledge and resources in the health and healthcare spaces. Outside of academic life, he leads an NGO, Amicus Onlus, which operates in healthcare, basic education, vocational skills training, and reintegration of returned illegal migrants to Europe in Ghana. Their work is mainly among rural communities and the underprivileged. And this dimension informs and complements his philosophical commitment to a more ethical world. We also have Sharon Kaur, who is a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Law, University of Malaya, where she has designed modules on healthcare law and ethics for undergraduate as well as postgraduate students, including modules on the Masters of Health Research Ethics at the Faculty of Medicine. Her research interests primarily revolve around medical research ethics and global health issues, and she's currently working on a Wellcome-funded project developing a Southeast Asian bioethics network with colleagues from University Malaya, the National University of Singapore, and the Mahidol Oxford Tropical Medicine Research Unit. And last but not least, we have Isabella Aboderin, who is the Perivoli Chair in Africa Research and Partnerships and the Director of PARC. Alongside her work here, Isabella is Professor of Gerontology in Bristol School of Policy Studies. Isabella is also an extraordinary professor at Northwest University, South Africa, and Associate Fellow of the African Population and Health Research Centre, Nairobi. Amongst other roles, Isabella serves as Regional Chair for Africa of the International Association of Gerontology and Geriatrics, is a member of the Global Commission on creating a roadmap for healthy longevity, and part of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Longevity. She is a trustee on the boards of the United Nations International Institute on Aging and the Population Reference Bureau. So quickly, a brief outline on how we'll proceed. First, we'll have Caesar share his thoughts on an African philosophical approach to global ethical issues, followed by Sharon on developing a Southeast Asian bioethics network. We'll have a quick 10-minute break for you to stretch your legs between 11:50 to 12 o'clock here in the UK. And then we'll follow that from 12 to 12:20 with Isabella on reflections from Perivoli Africa Research Centre and Transforming Africa Global North Research Partnerships. Then we'll have a panel discussion with all the panelists responding to questions that you will submit. Please add your questions, your comments into the chat. Matimba and Harleen will be keeping an eye on that. And so we'll pick up on that during the panel discussion before we conclude. And I hand back over to Matimba, Harleen, and Kumeri. Quick housekeeping before I hand over to our panelists. Do use the chat function. And just a reminder that we, of course, want this to be an open discussion, but we do expect everybody to engage ethically, thinking carefully about how we respect each other. If you have specific questions for speakers as they present, do make sure to reference that in the chat as well. And with that, I hand over to Caesar.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rishita. And really happy to be here to share some thoughts with you on African approaches to global bioethics issues or global bioethical issues. I'll try to share my slides. I hope I get it right. So, are they visible?
Yes.
Okay. So just, these are not really comprehensive slides. They're just a few thoughts that I wanted to use as a guide for our conversation today. I'm going to start off by saying, let's think a little bit about where we've gotten to, especially in the field of bioethics. And history is important. I mean, we all know that bioethics as a discipline emerged in the late 60s, 1970s. And at that time, especially in the global north, talking about Europe and the United States, there were a series of issues, I mean, medical paternalism, wrong practice in research ethics, and there was the need to address some of these issues. And also, I mean, the aftermath of the Second World War and what was done in the concentration camps in the name of research and Tuskegee and many other things, abuses that we know about. Now, what I want to say is that the discipline was shaped as a response to some of those problems that existed historically at that moment in time and in that place geographically. Because, I mean, the global north, Europe and the United States is a geographical location. It is not the whole universe. Now, what then happens is that, you know, when we're trying to look for ethical solutions about what is right and what is wrong, of course, we draw on our historical experiences. The issue is then that when we take solutions that have been generated in a certain context, a certain geographical location, to address problems that are particular to that location, and we universalize acritically those types of frameworks, we run the risk of actually practicing forms of colonization because we are not paying attention to the historical experiences of different peoples. And so what we do need to do, we need to take into consideration now that when we're in the field of global health, where we're trying to analyze problems globally, we will need to draw from the historical experiences and the challenges that various people face in order to be able to find global solutions. We cannot use one experience alone to be able to solve the problems of this world. What is more, the current issues that we are actually facing, and we will be facing, and these were mentioned by Rishita at the beginning. I mean, talk about climate change, talk about, antimicrobial resistance, talk about, emerging and re-emerging diseases. These problems are so complex that no single framework can address them adequately. So what we need today is to bring on board as much knowledge as possible, drawing from various traditions in order to be able to address the complexity of these problems. And actually, what we do need to learn or unlearn is that we now live in a world of complexity, and we need to get comfortable with complexity. So, what are the pitfalls of universalization when we begin to look at things maybe from, let's say, from the African context? Sometimes it becomes an issue of misplaced concreteness. Misplaced concreteness is one, and to give an example, when I look at the curricula for training in bioethics, among nursing students or medical students, we dedicate so much time to issues surrounding informed consent, when perhaps there are other more pressing issues like access, issues like even, corruption, that are actually crippling the health systems of our countries. Now, the interesting thing about the current framework that is dominant in bioethics is that it is a framework that is built on actually protecting the liberties of individuals. And this system has been quite effective in, creating frameworks to avoid paternalism, to avoid, abuse in research of research participants. But what we did see in the pandemic is actually, during the COVID-19 pandemic, is actually emblematic. Vaccines that were created with ethical approval, so they were generated, let's say, ethically, could not be distributed ethically. This means that the frameworks that we're using, which tend to focus a lot on individual liberties, have very, very strong or very, very, pronounced weaknesses when it comes to issues of governance. And when we're dealing with global health, we have to deal with issues of governance. So this is what we have. And how are we going to address this? Matimba and just make sure that I'm keeping to the time I've been allocated. So if I have a few minutes left, just let me know and I'll know how to end. Now, we all live in ethical environments. And speaking from an African viewpoint, one might say, okay, what is the ethical environment within which we live? And when I talk about ethical environments, I'm referring to the fact that, you know, the context in which we live, colors and characterizes how we perceive things as good, how we perceive them as bad, how we perceive them as, you know, blameworthy or praiseworthy. This is the ethical environment within which we live. And this ethical environment in Africa, across African countries as we have them today, actually are situated on what Kwame Nkrumah and Ali Masri describe as the triple heritage of Africa. And this triple heritage, reclassifying it in my own way, I call it, a heritage of coloniality and a strong religious presence across the continent, and an attachment to indigenous value systems. So this is the ethical environment, and ethical problems are analyzed within this context, keeping in mind these elements of our triple heritage. Now, the first one is coloniality. Most African countries, and as we know them today, are a product of the colonial state that created them. Now, the colonial state, even after independence, continued on the basis of what was created, and therefore continues on a system that today we call coloniality, which doesn't necessarily require the former colonizer to be present and guiding, but it continues on those systems, even in our educational systems. Now, coloniality as a system also suffers from the same moral wrong of colonialism, which is the subtraction of agency of peoples and the substitution of that agency in such a way that people who are always at the periphery will be working for the people who are at the center. Now, the centers have changed. So in the past, during the colonial era, the center might have been London or Paris. Today, the center can be Accra, it can be Lagos, it can be Nairobi, compared to the rural areas of these countries, of these African countries. And therefore, it is a question also of power. And this power is maintained through systems of epistemicide, which means, basically delegitimizing certain forms of knowledge and privileging other, forms of knowledge that conform to whoever is in power. And to make it more concrete, what I'm saying is that, for example, we know that at least 80% of Africans during their lifetimes at some point use traditional medicines. Yet when we are training medical practitioners across the African continent, we actually teach them anything about traditional medicine. And we actually create systems that not only but we even call it alternative medicine. This form of, epistemicide, which is killing of knowledge, impoverishes and also creates a sort of power system whereby you have to align to existing standards in order to be legitimate. Now, apart from the epistemicide, which is practiced even within the global health space across the continent, we also have issues of ecocide. And ecocide simply means that we keep reducing ourselves to a situation whereby we live, at least across the African continent, by selling nature. So we sell natural resources. And somehow, because that was the motive for which the colonial powers actually occupy the continent, we continue to do the same thing, believing that the only way we can progress and even provide healthcare is to destroy nature. This has devastating effects on the health of people. In Ghana, one of the main problems we have, which is called galamsey, is basically mining that is done, on artisanal basis, but that pollutes all the river bodies and ends up actually destroying lives and livelihoods. And of course, there are also issues linked to genocide that coloniality continues to propagate, which are linked to, forms of patriarchy, and also forms of actually, propagating myths of inferiority and other myths of superiority. These are the issues that we deal with when we're talking about anything ethical within the African context. Secondly, religion is widespread and widely practiced between especially the monotheistic religions, which have had their own forms of evolvement on the continent, and evolution on the continent. And this means that when we are dealing with ethical issues from abortion to euthanasia, or even to forms of clinical ethics, we need to take into account that the people who we are dealing with have a religious framework, and we have to learn how to engage with that. We cannot ignore it. It's the same thing even when we're talking about care. We are generally trained in our post-Enlightenment education that we should not engage with religion at all. But then how can you explain to somebody who holds deep beliefs, religious beliefs about their condition, and treat them in a so-called patient-centered healthcare without taking into account their value systems? So we need to learn how to engage with that. And of course, we have the indigenous value systems, which, philosophically, we've elaborated a lot on this. And these are value systems that insist a lot on prosocial virtues. So we're talking about a sort of virtuous communitarianism, which is opposed sometimes to a sort of individualistic entitlement type of ethical value systems. So if we're trying to work on an ethical framework in research ethics, in public health ethics, in clinical ethics, we need to take into account these sources of the ethical environment and learn how to engage with that. And I could give more examples, but maybe we'll talk about that during the Q&A. And so the task ahead, and just to sort of like summarize, is that what we are actually dealing with today requires a pluriversal approach to bioethics, which means that there is not just one way of doing bioethics. This, when sometimes I present this, people say, well, are you preaching sort of, moral relativism? No, this is not moral relativism by saying that everybody does what they think is right. And for that matter, you cannot even share values and all that. What I'm talking about is about reasoned disagreements. Amartya Sen describes this very well in one of his, in the 2011 Isaiah Berlin lectures, where he says, in order to be able to collaborate, we do not need full theoretical agreements. In fact, if we think about it deeply, the classical example is at the end of, during the 1940s, when the Allies came together to fight against Nazism, Russia, UK, the United States did not agree theoretically even on how to run their own countries, and they had different value systems. Yet they were able to agree on common goals. And so in front of the challenges that we have, especially within the health space, what we need to do is to allow for a plurality of approaches, but with shared goals. And this will allow us to be able to collaborate while exercising some degree of epistemic humility, which means that we recognize other people's value systems. And at the same time, we're willing to engage with them because we have shared desires and shared values. We all want to be healthy. And we want, our climate to be healthy. We want to be able to address the challenges that we're facing, except that we may approach them in different ways. This means that we will need to revisit the content of what we actually share when we're talking bioethics in global health and the procedures. For example, conflict resolution in many African settings is done through dialogical processes that requires forms of arriving at consensus, whereas we tend to look for more legal solutions when we are using, let's say, the imported colonial type of systems in order to be able to resolve problems, or we want frameworks with tick boxes to be able to solve problems. This is not always the case. That is, about what is required in all contexts. there is also an issue, issues of priority setting. You know, who decides what are the health priorities of a people? And who decides what sort of research should be done in various locations? Is it simply, I mean, what is worrying to whoever has the funding, the capacity to fund, or is it the needs of the place? I mean, one thing, just to mention an example, Mpox has been, I mean, endemic in Western and Central Africa for 4 decades. Mpox did not become a health priority until the disease started affecting people in the global north. Is this what makes things a priority when a disease hits people in the global north? And then, of course, and I'll try to end here so that I wouldn't go beyond my time. What I'm trying to get at with this is that, yes, we do need a form of global bioethics, because the problems and the challenges we share are global. They affect all of us. However, what is required is a pluriversal approach. And this pluriversal approach means that we need to ensure that we do not universalize acritically standards across the world, but rather draw from the ethical climate of the various places. And believe me, every society has ethical values. It's not only one society that has bioethics. And therefore, if we want to do bioethics in the context, we need to ask how, I mean, for example, and I'll just give an example. If I want to train medical doctors, researchers, or public health experts in a certain location about bioethics, I should not walk in there and tell them that, well, bioethics is about informed consent, it's about individual liberties and all that. I ought to start by asking them, in your view, who is a good doctor? Who is a good researcher? What does a good public health officer or practitioner look like? And what are the things that you think are priority? And then we can begin to find common ground. So this leads me to, I mean, all these initiatives that we have about capacity building, which become forms of epistemic colonization because we don't listen. And therefore, if we want to try to, I mean, carry out a truly global bioethics, I think we need to unlearn and relearn the way we go about things. Thank you. Over.
Thank you so much, Caesar. Lots of thought-provoking thoughts there. Sharon, I'll hand over to you if you're there and ready to share your slides when you're ready. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully this works. Is that all right?
Yeah, if you want to hit full screen.
Yeah. Does that work? Do I need to swap displays?
You do need to swap display. Yeah, perfect. Okay. That's great. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. And note to self, never go after Caesar, because you're just not going to sound very intellectual. That was an amazing talk. Thanks so much, Caesar. So I'm just going to talk a little bit today about some of the work we've done in trying to develop and build a Southeast Asian bioethics network. And you know, listening to what Caesar said earlier, I'd like to think that we're really trying to bring into our network and our process this notion of being this pluriversal approach as well as listening. So just quickly, some colleagues and I were very lucky, or some friends and I, to get a Wellcome Research Development Award in Humanities and Social Science, which provided us with a grant to shape the direction of the future work, to develop programs that allowed us to take risks and push academic boundaries. So this has been an amazing opportunity for us. And I think when I talk a little bit more about the type of work that we're trying to do, perhaps you'll understand why this award just really is so meaningful in our context. This is the team. So there are 5 of us, 2 of us from the University of Malaya, Firdaus and myself, 2 from National University of Singapore, Teck Chuan and Tamara, although Tamara is going to be leaving for the University of Sydney soon, and Professor Chia Pik Yong from Oxford University at Mahidol Oxford Research Unit in Bangkok. And this is Southeast Asia, just for people who may not be entirely sure where we are. We are tucked away in a little corner of Asia, and you can see that we're between the two giants of India and China. So this is the geographic sort of delineation of Southeast Asia. It doesn't map alongside the WHO division of Sierra. So this is actually what geographically Southeast Asia counts as. And it's Brunei, Cambodia, East Timor, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And as you would imagine, we really, even though we occupy a tiny little corner of Asia, we have a huge diversity of languages, of ethnicities, of cultures, religious traditions, different political systems, as well as economic development. So you have, for instance, Singapore on one end of the scale, and you have countries like Laos and Myanmar on the other end of the scale. So there's a huge amount of diversity in so many different ways. And this is my short plug for come to Southeast Asia and visit us. And we have great food. So this is what we want to do. This is our dream, right? We want to set up a bioethics network in Southeast Asia to shape a future research agenda that is based on the unheard voices in the region. And we really think that if you think about the larger bioethics discourse, Southeast Asia is actually quite a silent region. There's a huge amount, obviously, coming out of the West. There's a huge amount that comes out of Africa, even Latin America. There's quite a bit that comes out of India and China and some from Japan and a bit from Taiwan, but very, very little that comes out of Southeast Asia. And perhaps the most sort of prolific area is Singapore, which is really atypical within Southeast Asia because it's very different. And we really think that there are voices that have yet to be heard. Voices of people who are in effect practicing and producing bioethics who are not recognized as bioethicists, people in villages, headmen, religious leaders who are talking to people, thinking about and discussing, things that mean that are very deep and touch at the heart of what it is to be human and the decisions that are made in the context of bioethics, but they're not professional bioethicists. They are voices of marginalized populations such as migrant workers and refugees. Because they don't have a political voice, because they are so completely oppressed and marginalized in the societies that they live in, that they simply do not have a voice, as well as voices of Southeast Asians who come from a multiplicity of faiths and cultures. How Buddhism is practiced in Myanmar might be very, very different from how it is practiced in Vietnam, or even how it is practiced in Malaysia and Singapore, and what it means to be a Buddhist in these different places. We just don't really know very much about it. And so we challenge ourselves that we want to be able to think about how we might think differently about bioethics issues based on these voices. So again, as Caesar suggested, we want to listen, we want to hear, we want to explore and discover, and then we want to sit back and think, well, now, how does that cohere with how we understand bioethics, or how typically bioethics is presented in the larger discourse? And significantly, we also want to know and see where we can bring about positive change. Our guiding principles, they always sound kind of cool, right? We want to discover and bring into the bioethical and public discourses the voices of many cultural and religious traditions in the region. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that's actually very, very challenging and difficult. We want to advocate for change and challenge orthodoxy, because we realize that, because of historical injustices and present political systems and economic situations, there's a huge amount of injustice. We want to be able to speak to it. We want to not just speak about it and to it, but we want to advocate for change where we can. And again, there are challenges associated with that. And above all, I think we want to build a vibrant, inclusive, and collaborative bioethics community in Southeast Asia. I think we don't know where this community is yet, and we really want to be part of building it together. And we're lucky enough to have a bit of money to do that. Based on our present research interests and expertise, we thought we'd start out with two thematic areas. First, we were very interested in looking at emerging issues relating to healthcare for and research with mobile and marginalized populations in the region, as well as the challenges and opportunities presented by emergent health and biomedical technologies. We've only just really, we're about a year into our project, so we've kind of started. We've just recently published a piece on migrant health ethics in Southeast Asia, where we did a scoping review, and we also interviewed some stakeholders. And again, I think we try and approach this whole thing hopefully with a sense of humility, that we think we know what's out there, but really we're not entirely sure if we do. And so we're really just searching and trying to discover and see. The key drivers for migration in our region are primarily labor migration. We have both sending and receiving countries. So we have countries like Vietnam and Myanmar, Indonesia and Philippines, which send out large numbers of migrants. We have primarily receiving countries such as Singapore and Malaysia, Brunei and Thailand. And we also have shifting trends where Vietnam was very much a sending country, but now as their economic circumstances improve, they have increasingly become a receiving countries. What does it mean to the people in these countries? What does it mean for the families that they leave behind? There is also forced migration, which is driven by conflict and violence. We have large numbers of people, especially, as everyone would know, the Rohingya population that are moving both out of Southeast Asia and within Southeast Asia. And we are also increasingly seeing environmental migration, especially within countries. We see internal displacement in countries such as the Philippines and Indonesia, where because of environmental reasons, because of earthquakes, typhoons, floods, people are moving. And I think that's only going to increase. So that's something that we also want to be mindful about. So I'll just summarize some of this, because you don't want me reading through it because it'll be really boring. That really, we found that most of the literature at present really is from the perspective of high income countries, and that the output of migrant health ethics in Asia is relatively low, but we have very high numbers. And so there is a need to increase funding, human resources, and research output in migration health in this region. So we're quite convinced that this is what we need to do. And we also engage with regional stakeholders, because in our scoping review, we didn't find very much. We spoke to UN agencies, we spoke to civil society organizations, as well as members of the communities from migrant populations. And we really highlighted some areas that we think we should be looking into, primarily research involving migrant children. There's very little work that's done in Southeast Asia. Research from migrant sending countries. There's quite a lot of research from Malaysia and Singapore and Thailand on receiving countries and the plight of migrants, but really we don't understand very well what happens when people leave their homes, when women leave their families, what happens to the children that are left behind, what does it mean for the health of the communities and the families in these places, and the quality of migrant care. That because it's so context dependent, we really need to understand how we are actually providing healthcare services to migrant communities. What are the ethical frameworks? What is being done well? What is being done badly? What can we learn from each other? And also research with internal migrants, that there's not enough work being done in relation to people moving within their countries for whatever reasons, but they are also communities that are marginalized and need to be thought of. And the other big area is emerging technologies. Because Southeast Asia, with the exception of Singapore and Brunei, is composed of primarily of lower middle income countries, we recognize that although emerging health and biomedical technologies offer a great deal of promise, There are also challenges associated with it. We're particularly interested in looking at jurisdictional shopping or ethics dumping, how it occurs, what it means. We are also very interested in learning about data sharing and promoting equity. Again, what it means in these communities. What does it even mean to think about data or information in different Southeast Asian communities? What is privacy? How is information shared? So we just really want to think about that. And we feel that Southeast Asian voices are unrepresented in this discourse. Actually, that's not fair. I think I would say underrepresented in this discourse. And the aim of this project, again, is to discover these voices and bring them into the contemporary discourse. So these are some of the things that we're doing. And again, we're pretty much, this is my defense. Call me back next year and we'll see if we've achieved any of these things. We have started by conducting a mixed methods Delphi study between May and October 2023. So we're almost at the end of it. And you know what, we did this because we realized that, well, the 5 of us actually have fairly strong opinions about what sort of research we want to do and what are the ethical issues. We don't necessarily know. And as Caesar said, we need to listen. So we have already done an online semi-structured interview to explore ideas surrounding current bioethics. We have spoken to participants from 10 out of the 11 countries in Southeast Asia. We haven't yet managed to find anybody from Timor-Leste to speak to. And in October, which is next, I was going to say in a couple of months, but in next month, we're going to bring everybody together for a workshop in Langkawi, which is an island in Malaysia, to discuss the priority areas, to really work through even our mission and vision. So rather than us deciding what our mission and vision really is going to be, we thought, well, we'll get together with a lot of other people from Southeast Asia and try and figure out what does it mean, or what should it mean for us as a Southeast Asian Bioethics Network? What should our vision be? What should our mission be? In January, we're planning for an AI and health research ethics workshop. We're partnering with the Global Forum on Bioethics here, where we have someone from Malaysia who's managed to get a meeting fellowship, and we're going to work with him to think about AI and health research in Malaysia and try and, so we're trying to do it as different levels of activity. We're going to have a workshop thinking about some of the theoretical issues. We're going to follow that on with a public forum, and then maybe with a roundtable for policymakers to see whether we can have impact at different levels. And if that sort of works well, maybe we'll take our show on the road and we'll try and do this in different countries as well, because I think that will be quite interesting. We also have some money to provide various funding opportunities. We will launch this in the first quarter of 2024. So again, watch this space. I'll show you our website, a link to our website in a bit. We will be offering seed grants, fellowships, internships, and apart from the 2 thematic areas where we will lead some of the research, we really want to find out, what do researchers in Southeast Asia or Southeast Asians doing research, what do you want to do? How do you want to, what are the voices that you want to uncover, and bring that into the discourse. I'm almost done. So I thought quickly I'd share some of our challenges and opportunities. And I thought I'd map them alongside some of our guiding principles, because it's quite nice that even at this early stage, we're thinking about some things and noticing some challenges. We want to bring the voices into the fore. But I think we've really realized that in Southeast Asia, we have voices in many different languages. There's Thai, there's Vietnamese, there's Burmese, and even within that, there are, the dialects. And these are not necessarily big languages. So how do we do it, right? Because we want people to speak in their authentic voices. We don't want them to necessarily feel that they have to learn a different language and write in a different language. So we're thinking, well, maybe we need to invest in translating. Maybe we need to try and develop translation as a bioethics career, right? So you have bioethics translators and actually have a career path for them, where you really become good at having rich bioethics discourses in both languages, because while it's important, we think, to have these discussions brought into the broader bioethics discourse, we think it's also very important to have these materials and these discussions at a national level as well. So how do we ensure that local populations maintain access to materials in their own language at the same time? Because some of this is going to be most impactful within the countries. So we're working quite closely here with the Asian Bioethics Review, which is a journal that's run out of NUS. And so here it's an opportunity where we have the opportunity to partner with ABR to see maybe what we can do, what will be useful, and how we can sort of promote the writing and the dissemination of this information and these discourses without diluting them. I really am almost done. Advocate change and orthodoxy, because we're looking at migrant populations, because we're looking at things that are politically very sensitive. How do we do this, and how do we ensure the safety of researchers and communities? At present, we have on our advisory boards individuals from UN agencies, working closely with civil society organizations. I think it's a great opportunity. It might be tough, but I'm really looking forward to doing that. And just building a vibrant community. How do we ensure inclusivity and equity? I think that's going to be a huge challenge. We're really looking to find partners across the region. Our workshop is our first step towards that. And this is, we have a little website. It's still a baby website. Lots still needs to be developed, but you can go there. You can sign up for our newsletters or our emails, and we will send you material. And just from all of us in Southeast Asia, thank you. Over.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Sharon. And I'm looking forward to hearing where you are next year as well. It sounds like a lot of incredible projects. Thank you both, Caesar and Sharon, for these incredible presentations. Lots to think about. And we have about 8-ish minutes for a bit of a break. That's great, actually, bang on time, easiest sharing gig that I've had in a while. So we've got 8 minutes. If you can all come back, go stretch your legs, grab a drink of water, and we'll see you back here in about 8 minutes, where we'll be listening to Isabella and her presentation. So see you in about 8 minutes, everybody. Hey, hello everyone, welcome back. Hope you've had a little bit of break, get some water, a cup of tea, and a chance to stretch your legs if you need it. And we will start, we'll come back with Isabella, who I'll hand over to in a moment, but just a quick reminder to please add your questions in the Q&A, and we will pick up after Isabella's presentation in our upcoming panel discussion. Thanks everyone, and I'll hand over to Isabella now.
Thank you very much, Rishita. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, perfect.
Great. Okay, so thank you very much. And I just wanted to say that it's really great to be part of this forum, and listening to Caesar's and Sharon's presentations, I got really excited because, you know, thinking about the subtitle of this particular session, In Search of Common Ground, it really seems to me that there is much common ground that we can build on. So I look forward to the discussions in this forum, but then hopefully also, you know, the discussions that will follow after it. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Hoping that you can all see.
Yes, you might want to make it full screen. Yep, perfect. Looks great. Yep.
Okay. Okay, so what I want to talk about or to share with you is to reflect on an initiative that we are taking forward at the moment, a joint endeavor together with the major higher education bodies, constituencies in Africa, and co-facilitated with the Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town and the University of South Africa, which is specifically about the need to advance what we've called transformative research collaborations as a way to ensure that Africa takes its rightful place in global scientific knowledge production. And I will start with this. This is the Africa Charter on Transformative Research Collaborations, which provides a framework of principles and aspirations precisely to transform the ways in which research collaborations between Africa and Global North unfold, and which at the moment serve to really marginalize the continent in terms of its positionality in global scientific knowledge production. What I'd like to do today, we launched this charter in July this year in Windhoek, in conjunction with the Conference of Rectors, Vice Chancellors and Principals of African Universities. And what I'd like to do here is to just share with you some of the key arguments that underpin this framework, and then return to it and invite all of you to join in the conversation and in the wider initiative that's now unfolding. So the first thing to note, and I think this is really important, is that international research collaborations, in particular with Europe, North America, and Australia, actually dominate Africa's scientific effort. They dominate Africa's scientific outputs. And latest data from the UNESCO World Science Report really illustrates that. You know, it shows that 88% is the average share of publications with foreign co-authors in Central and East Africa. This is between 2017 and 2019. In some countries, this figure goes up to 100%. And the corresponding figure for Southern Africa is 85%, with lower percentages for South Africa and Mauritius. They are really exceptions. So, you know, the dominance of international research collaborations is something that we need to appreciate. And what this means really is that these research collaborations actually define Africa's engagement in the global scientific effort, and perhaps more importantly, they underpin its present positioning in this effort. And again, if we look at all the data, all the metrics that we currently have available, it's very clear that this positioning at the moment is deeply unfavorable. So if we look at data on researchers and outputs, again, this is from the World Science Report, we see that Central, East, Southern, Western Africa together in 2018 constituted 10% of the global adult population, but only less than 1% of all researchers globally. This is the lowest percentage of all major regions, and only 1.6% of scientific publications globally, half of those being from South Africa. And this compares unfavorably, as you can see here, to figures for other regions in the global south. I should say, of course, that this reflects only publications that are in indexed journals and doesn't include, the considerable volume of publications in African journals published in the continent that are not indexed. But that in and of itself is another factor, driver of this marginalized positionality of the continent in global science and research. If we look at metrics to do with rankings, rankings of course are deeply problematic. Nonetheless, they provide an indication. We see that the latest rankings, QS rankings, for example, shows only one Africa university, that's UCT, in the top 200. Only 7 are in the top 500, 5 of those in South Africa, 2 in Egypt. And then no African university outside South Africa, Ghana, Egypt, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Tunisia is in the top 1,000, which also points to, the huge disparities in scientific knowledge production within the continent, which are part of the problem. And I think Caesar spoke to this as well. If we look at rankings at the individual level, these are data from 2020. We see that of the more than 6,000 highest ranked scholars, only 12 are affiliated to African institutions, 9 of which are in South Africa. So it gives you a picture of the positionality, the current positionality of Africa in the global scientific effort. And this positionality really reflects what I think we can call an uneven playing field in scientific knowledge production, which is constitutive of multiple layers of power imbalances. And this heuristic, if you like, just tries to illustrate these layers of power imbalance in scientific knowledge production, all of which, or most of which, Caesar also touched on in his presentation. So at the very core, you have imbalances to do with the use of epistemologies, knowledge frameworks that are Western in origin, that marginalize epistemologies, ways of knowing from the continent. A second layer of imbalances closely related has to do with language. I think Sharon spoke to language too. Language, with the dominant languages used in scientific knowledge production being English, French, or former colonial languages. And this is an issue not just in terms of dissemination, but it is actually an issue, a problem of the knowledge that is produced, because language is where knowledge resides. And so the language that you use to produce knowledge really matters for the kind of knowledge and the kinds of understandings you end up generating. A third layer of imbalances, closely again linked to the first two, is the dominant use of theories on Western theories, Eurocentric theories, concepts, conceptions, interpretations of the world, how the world works in scientific knowledge production, and going with it, what Montangy has called a sense of extraversion, a look to the West as the site of producing scientific theory, with Africa using those theories and just providing data and field impressions to go with it. A fourth hugely important layer of asymmetries in research, in collaborative research that involves Africa is imposed by the development frame. So just as there is a dominance of Eurocentric theories and ideas of how the world works, there is a dominance of Eurocentric theories, ideas, conceptions of how the world ought to work, what constitutes individual flourishing, what constitutes societal flourishing. Of course, at the moment, the development frame is captured in the SDGs, but there are many other frames that are underpinned by these Eurocentric ideas of how the world ought to work. And what this development frame does, and again, Sharon and Caesar, I think both you spoke to that, is a number of things. One, it delimits the areas, both substantive and geographical, that are deemed relevant for inquiry by researchers in the continent or from the continent. It imposes a particular narrative of what the problems and what the solutions of development are, and doesn't really allow inquiry into alternative narratives, alternative understandings of what development is and what the problems are. That's one thing, and of course related to that is that the development frame imposes almost always a unidirectional gaze from the global north to Africa. So Africa rendered as a site of investigation, of intervention, and never is this gaze returned or indeed reversed. So this is a critical, another layer of power imbalances. And then a last one, which builds on the last four, on the previous four, is really the vast disparities in resourcing and capabilities, including to do with data infrastructures between higher education or research institutions in the continent and those outside of it, specifically in the global north. This uneven playing field in knowledge production, together with the actual position of Africa in the global science and research ecosystem, has negative repercussions. You know, it's not accidental and it's not harmless. It has negative repercussions for the political and economic prospects of the continent, because power hierarchies in knowledge production translate into power hierarchies in the political economy. That's one. But also, and again, this is a point that Caesar, I think you highlighted very strongly, it has repercussions for the potency, for the richness of global scholarship. This means that in many ways, there is an imperative for rebalancing current positionings and relations in the global scientific effort. If you like, there is a need to ensure that African scholars, African institutions, and knowledges produced from the continent take their rightful place in this global scientific effort. This is a matter of social justice. Some would argue it is a matter of restorative justice, but it is also a matter of fostering the richer, the pluriversal science that we need, to properly support human dignity, to address the global challenges we collectively face, and to offer alternatives, what Odora Hoppers has called the monochrome logic of Western thought, which, if you think about it, has in many ways gotten us to the crises and the upheavals that we're facing today. So given that this is an imperative, the question is, well, if you are saying we need to change, we need to rebalance the global scientific effort, the positionalities in it, how do we do it? And here, this is where the Charter argues that we need to understand that because international research collaborations dominate the scientific effort that's going on in the continent, they actually offer an entry point or a leverage point for advancing such a rebalancing of the global science and research ecosystem as a whole. In other words, these collaborations have the potential to be transformative. What would that take? What would a transformative mode of research collaborations take? Well, it would mean redressing the layers of power imbalances. So of course, it would mean ensuring greater equity, greater fairness in practical collaboration arrangements, in the division of labor, who's PI, who has control over budgets, and so on. And as all of you probably will have come across, these are very much the issues that the present equitable partnerships debates and frameworks tackle. Very important. But in addition, there is need for collaborations to actively redress these 5 other layers of power imbalance that I just spoke to, at the epistemological level, the language level, the level of theories, concepts, the development frame and gaze, and the resourcing at institutional levels. Of course, a transformative mode of collaborations is fine, but we need to ensure that with time, such a mode is embedded, is instituted as best, and then as standard practice. And this needs complex change. It needs far-reaching change in individual consciousness and capabilities, in shared norms, in resource streams, and very importantly, in policy and regulatory frameworks, which really set the rules of the game. And when I say policy and regulatory frameworks, I mean amongst universities, higher education institutions themselves, funders, publishers, research assessment bodies, science governance bodies, and governments ultimately as well. And this is what the Charter speaks to. It provides a set of principles for transformative research collaborations, and it sets out a set of aspirations for policy change in these various domains of the higher education and research ecosystem. What is noteworthy and what in many ways surpassed our expectations is the wide embrace, the great resonance that this Charter framework has already garnered, not just during the launch in Windhoek, but also thereafter. And what we now have is a growing open coalition of almost close to 100 major Africa and global university networks, academic associations, and then leading individual universities and research institutions in Africa, in Europe, in North America, and in Latin America, who have all endorsed the principles and aspirations of this Charter, and who have pledged or have resolved to engage in and support what now must become a wider initiative to advance the implementation, the realization of these aspirations and these principles. And I want to stop there and invite all of you to join us, to join the conversation, to join the debate, to join the initiatives that will now be taken forward together collectively by the three institutions I mentioned at the beginning, but more broadly, this coalition that has now formed behind the Charter. So I'll stop here, Rishita, and hand back to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. This has been a dream panel. I've not had to really chase anybody on like keeping to time. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you for these really inspiring for me personally, but also really thought-provoking and provocative thoughts. I'll invite all the panelists to turn their cameras on as we move to our Q&A session, if that would be okay. The Q&A has been hopping. There's a lot of really interesting questions in here. I will beg indulgence from those who've asked questions, so I'll try and expand it a little bit more so it can speak to all of our panelists and those and their presentations as well. So first is a question from Talia, and this was specifically in relation to Caesar's talk around vaccinations and how when Caesar said that vaccinations can it wasn't just that they weren't distributed equitably. Talia wonders if it's not just that they could not be distributed equitably, but is it that, or was it that they were not meant to be distributed equally as part of neoliberal necropolitics? And I think I'd like to expand this a little bit more from not just vaccines, but we could argue this, I guess, for resource allocation more broadly, and even in the context of what Isabella was talking about with research allocation, the access to funds for research itself in this research ecosystem. Something, some would argue that these neoliberal necropolitics are a function of that development gaze that Isabella was touching on earlier as well. I'll invite the panel to respond to that more broadly. Is it a function of this?
Do you want me to take this question? Okay.
Yes, and then I'll invite the others to respond.
Yes, it is. I mean, it is a question of power, and it's a question of money. Now, the question on vaccines is linked to even the whole knowledge production and health intervention production chain. And here, I think this is linked, I mean, this is quite close to the work that, I mean, Isabella is doing as well. You see, there is a subtle shift in value systems from the knowledge generating phase to the distribution of interventions. And this is where ethics needs to really change the way we do things and look at the governance structure. So at the beginning of research, we insist on a certain number of values like knowledge sharing, data sharing, which are values that one may classify as solidaristic values, because we want everybody to have access to data, to be able to do research and all that. But interestingly, as the chain develops and this knowledge is gradually being transformed into health interventions, we slip in a different set of values. And those values become more neoliberal and more centered on individual ownership and profit. So it's like, the way I often describe this to my students, like you set out to play a game, let's say soccer or basketball or volleyball, you set out with a set of rules, but as the game is going on, some of the players are changing the rules without actually stating it. So at the end of the day, yes, I think, I mean, the underlying issue of neoliberal, capitalism is a problem here. And it needs to be addressed. So we need to have, as part of a framework, a shared set of values that we can embrace from the beginning to the end. We can't keep changing the values as we're going along the chain. And this is obvious. So we can actually collect data and collect samples. Even we saw that in the HIV, outbreak, epidemic. We saw that in COVID as well. You can collect data. Everybody needs to sort of like share data, samples, and knowledge. But when this matures into an intervention, no, it is protected by IP rights. What's going on? And secondly, just to talk about, the allocation of resources. As ethicists, we are often called in to try and build frameworks for fair allocations of resources, scarce resources within the health space. However, as ethicists, we are often not allowed to question whether the scarcity is induced or it is real. And quite often, the scarcity could actually have been avoided if we face the broader questions. That is why, I would say it is important not to box ourselves into ethics that is just about have people given consent or not given consent. Over.
Thank you, Caesar. Would Isabella or Sharon like to respond or build on what Caesar said?
I'm looking at Sharon. Are you speak? Then I go after.
Okay, sure. I think just a small point that I've been thinking about, especially given that we've got this grant, and it's a great thing because we've been given a fairly large tranche of money, and it shouldn't be something to complain about. But I think even the way grants are structured, the way money is delivered, the conditions under which you have to operate don't always take into account the way perhaps institutions and things are run in a different country, especially perhaps in an LMIC. And so sometimes that makes it really difficult because, and I'm not saying that it's necessarily a first world, third world sort of a problem that the richer countries or the high income countries need to change the way in which they offer this funding or the way that they give this money out. But I find that that's really been something that's really difficult for me in the way that my institution may not be ready or able to be flexible with the money and just the way, so I think, for instance, in the North now, a lot of the money for bioethicists and bioethics research goes to postdoc researchers. But in a country like Malaysia and many of the Southeast Asian countries, there are no postdoc bioethicists, right? There are barely master's students who've got bioethics degrees. And so how then, what the money that you need maybe is to develop and really build capacity and to train, but that money is not really accounted for in a lot of the research money that's given to you, because that's just not what is done, and it's not good use of money in a high income country. And I think just the way sometimes the funding is structured can be quite not obstructive, but can make life really quite difficult. So even though they're giving you a lot of money, it can be really, really difficult sometimes to use it in a way that's meaningful in the South over.
Maybe just a very brief reflection, I suppose touching on both Caesar's and Sharon's points. I think, to my mind, the question speaks to the fact that what happened with the vaccines and the scarcity and the distribution of those, to me, illustrates the very fact that power and positioning in terms of knowledge production, in this case, producing the vaccines, doing the research, translates into power and influence economically and politically. And so it wasn't, taking Africa as an example, it wasn't Africa who could determine how are these vaccines produced, who gets them, etc. It was the countries who are controlling, who have invested over the years, over the decades, in the kind of capabilities to develop these vaccines. And it speaks to me also to an illustration of what I meant when I spoke about the development frame. And I suppose the question of the issue of what questions are we asking? What are we doing in terms of our research? The development frame, the SDGs, it's fine. Of course, we need to look at education systems, health systems, etc. But because most of the funding is aligned with this development frame, it doesn't allow for research, including basic research, to go on, that doesn't directly speak to any of the SDGs or only in an indirect way. That is not considered relevant for Africa at this point in time. Space research, music, research in the humanities, these are not considered relevant, and so that doesn't happen. So this to me is an illustration of the power imbalances that we need to tackle at a structural level.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to put two questions together. I'm not going in the order that they've been asked, so I'll move them around a little bit, but I'm going to put two questions together. So one of the questions was, again, I think particularly speaks to Caesar and Isabella's work, around what do you think of the current tendency to consider the Ubuntu philosophy as the cornerstone or the key point of reference for African ethics, and how, if we extend that, I think we can talk about this more broadly to, say, particular frameworks from Asia or from Latin America that might also become the du jour, as it were. So if we think about in Latin America, how a lot of the ecofeminist perspectives have tended to feature of the duality of nature and life, and how that's become the go-to perspective. So I'll open this up again. Perhaps Isabella, you'd like to start, and then Caesar, and then Sharon, if we could do it like that. Reflect on this tendency, not just of one idea becoming the cornerstone, and what that might mean for for the epistemologies that are possible, the pluriverse that is possible, and whether that can in some way lead to a co-optation of these ideas as well.
Okay, I'll have a go. And I need to preface this by saying that while this is hugely important, it's not an area that I've done much research on, or in fact thought that much about. So, you know, my answer might be quite limited. But I suppose my main view here would be that it's always very, very dangerous to essentialize Africa and speak about African ethics, although I know that there are commonalities. It's possible to find commonalities in ethical perspectives and frames across the continent. And I won't say much more because Caesar, you will no doubt correct me. But I think, yes, there is a tendency now to speak about Ubuntu. You know, it's sort of sexy, it's the thing at the moment. But I think we as researchers outside the continent, especially the diaspora, but also inside of the continent, are really called upon to better understand what our ethical frames and values are, because, you know, of course they evolve, and I'm not sure how much empirical inquiry has been done. How much do we understand what the ethical frames of reference now are across different contexts in Africa, in the continent? And I think that there is a real need for investing in that kind of research, rather than just focusing on one philosophy that obviously resonates strongly in many quarters, but certainly probably is not the only one. Over.
Caesar, you're muted.
Right. Yeah, I agree entirely with what Isabella has said. It is true that, I mean, Ubuntu has become a kind of fashionable term that is often employed in contexts of African philosophy, African ethics. And it is also true that quite a number of the ideas represented within the sort of philosophy, Ubuntu philosophy, do resonate with many peoples across the continent in terms of having a more communal approach and a relational understanding of who we are and what we ought to be. Now, the dangers are also real because we can fall into a sort of essentialization. However, I just want to echo what Isabella has said. Africa is quite a wide and a large continent. I mean, we're talking today of about 54 countries made up of thousands of different traditions and indigenous communities. And I mean, even there, sometimes we really need to give a lot of respect to this diversity that exists across the continent. And also allow for even a plurality of voices within the continent. So at least in philosophy anyway, we do not all agree on the same set of ideas. And that is the wealth of thinking. And it ought to be that way, because that is how we can all contribute to building up, a body of ideas and concepts that we can actually throw out to help ourselves and to even contribute to global thinking. So trying to reduce, African thinking to just Ubuntu may be an act of essentializing and actually limiting. And what we need to do is to give space to these sort of, to the various expressions that there are. At the same time, too, we need to recognize that, like in all contexts, even when we talk about Europe and the United and North America, for example, one can say that, utilitarianism as a philosophy has a dominant voice compared to some other forms of philosophy. So sometimes you do have certain currents of thought that exercise a great deal of dominance. And at the moment, what we're seeing is that Ubuntu is exercising quite a large dominance on the African space, but it is not the only one, and it should not be considered as the only way of doing philosophy. And then to realize that even among those who write about Ubuntu, there are diversity of opinions. And this brings me to, and I'll close here, when we're talking about ethics and about doing, the pluriversal approach for me is an efficient approach, which allows us to have these sort of differences in our thinking. But we can actually have shared goals. And what is important is to work towards those shared goals that can help us get to where we want to get to, but not try to impose one way of thinking.
Yeah, I would totally agree with Caesar as well as Isabella. And I think, similarly in Southeast Asia and in Asia in general, there are so many different cultures and ways of thinking. And I think that there is a tyranny if you think that any one approach is the only or the dominant and the right approach. Similarly, I also think that and this comes from, I think, being a lawyer, there's a danger in a purely pluralistic approach to say that everybody's values should be accepted and embraced, because you can have a relational understanding that can be very oppressive and coercive. Similarly, you can have an individualistic approach that can do exactly the same thing. And that's really primarily dependent on context. So I would think rather than thinking about a single approach or a dominant value that should be applied in any particular context, I think it's really wise to think about and listen to and subject to rigorous analysis and testing and argument any particular approach that is either local or traditional in a specific context. And I think Caesar makes a good point. What are the goals we're trying to reach, and what do these values, do they help, do they hinder? So I think a lot of really interesting normative work remains to be done in this field. Over.
Thank you. So the next question specifically was for Isabella, where they ask, regarding the general paucity in the citing of African researchers, is it because researchers in the global north are hesitant to cite publications from Africa or African journals, perhaps due to a belief that these publications may be erroneous or irrelevant or dispensable in the academic discourse? And this is something that can be tantamount then to testimonial injustice. And I think, Sharon, as well, that might extend to research from Southeast Asia potentially as well, if in terms of not just a space to conduct research, but also whether that research and that knowledge is seen as valuable and valid.
I'll have a go very quickly. So thanks for that question. So we do know that publications with an African author are cited much much more poorly than our publications that come from, let's say, global north institutions or scholars only. The question is, why is that? And I think, well, maybe there are three answers to that question. One is, again, in some ways, that's an empirical question. And I think it goes to, the need to really engage individual mindsets, consciousness, to understand, maybe the biases, the perspectives that individual scholars in the global north or more broadly globally have in terms of how they engage with the existing body of knowledge. So that's one. The other is, of course, that a lot of research output from the continent is published in journals that are not indexed. They're not part of this Global Citation Index database of, I think, 9,000, in quotes, notable journals. So a lot of work goes on that isn't on the radar if you just use the normal search engines, for example, the normal databases. Of course, there are initiatives now, not now, for quite a while, African Journals Online, there's Africa Archive, that are trying to highlight, increase the visibility of African scholarly output and engagement with it. But, you have to go out and look for them. So that's another, maybe a piece of the puzzle. And then the last really might be about to do with perceptions of quality, of I don't know, rigor, of relevance, which again, brings me to my initial point, that this is a need, this is an area that really requires some empirical work to better understand mindsets, perspectives in the global scholarly community. Over.
Oh, me, I'll try. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think maybe from a bioethics point of view, and if I'm thinking about it from a Southeast Asian point of view, I think there genuinely is very little normative stuff coming out of Southeast Asia at the moment. So there may be some empirical work coming out, and that may not necessarily, so that's probably cited, but at a very different level, just as evidence of this and that. And again, taking Isabella's point, there's a perception, I think, that's a lower level, less high quality sort of research and writing, as opposed to the more normative and analytical work. And I think that's also down to language, because, as Caesar mentioned, analysis, Isabella as well, analysis can only be done in a language. And, really strong philosophical work, you need to have the language to be able to do it. And at present, everything is primarily done in English. So if you don't have that capacity, even the quality of your analysis is likely to be seen to maybe be lacking, simply because you're not speaking in a language that you're accustomed to. And also the reference frameworks are still very much Western philosophy. So unless you can speak to the Kants and to the John Stuart Mills of it, you're not necessarily regarded as doing very high quality work if you're not making these very high level Western philosophical considerations. And maybe this will change, but that's what I think of.
Thanks. Caesar, any comments, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Isabella and Sharon have said it all. There is a bit of an irony in this as well, because it is also true that, unfortunately, we do have poor outputs coming out within our African space, whereby, and you see, this is tied to the kind of coloniality power system where universities want people to publish in order to advance in their careers. At the same time, access to Global North journals and all that, which, open access costs and everything, gets very difficult. So people come up with journals which are just oriented to improving their careers, and therefore does not produce quality. And this is where we need to, really work on the normativity, even about promotions within career advancement within our universities. Are we just importing certain criteria and imposing that is actually driving people into a space of inferior production? And then take up the challenge too about the access to journals. So these are ethical issues that we need to broaden the conversation around ethics, around what is ethical.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And that actually leads really well onto the next question, where the audience member was asking about how there seems to be quite little normative discourse from within the Global South, and suggesting that there's been such an emphasis on empirical evidence and building empirical work. And how might we, is that something to be concerned about? Are normative discourses something we ought to be moving towards? Or should we be thinking more about, which touches on another question that was asked, on how do we push beyond research, beyond just the philosophical? How do we translate this from theory into practice? I'll open that up. If you feel moved to respond, feel free to do so.
Well, if it's normative, I suppose, Sharon ought to start. You're the lawyer. Anyway, do you want to go, Sharon?
No, I think I'll leave normativity to you because you're the philosopher.
Well,
go on, Caesar.
Okay, I'm going to try. Yes, there is little normativity, and it is a complex discourse because the institutions that we have to promote normativity across across Africa, let's just put it this way, many of them are the states, the African states, right? Because the governments exist to sort of like create normative policies and all that. Now, what are the sources that the states in Africa draw from in order to create norms? Most of the time, these are borrowed normative systems that we actually receive and try to translate. Therefore, the normativity is not, the information that we draw from to create our norms does not start from below, but it starts from above. And so, yeah, we have, universal human rights, SDGs, Millennium Development Goals, and all these. And we then collect the normativity around that and generate normativity for the local context. And I think Isabella refers to this, the empirical work that needs to be done. How do local communities actually create sustainable development goals for themselves? And if they've been able to survive for so long, they must have some form of sustainability. So that sort of empirical work needs to be done. And a certain shift of mind from, I think Isabella referred to Huntonji's extraversion, which is where we're looking, the gaze to see whether we are okay, is the outside gaze. That is what we need to work on. But to be able to do that too, we will need to revisit, and the work is enormous, we'll need to revisit even our educational systems. Because the educational system across many parts of, the formerly colonized territories seeks to alienate you from your indigenous culture. And therefore, the people who are like researchers and all that are actually to some extent alienated, and they find it difficult to be able to draw from the local sources and easier to draw from the, Sharon said, from the Kants and the Stuart Mills, because that's what we've been fed with at the university. So there is work to be done there.
Yeah, and just to add to Caesar's wonderful start, I think, again, and to tie that in with what you said at the end, Rishita, is that how do you translate this work into practice? That's really a dilemma, because a lot of the empirical work is really, really important if you want to translate it into action, because you need to show, as Caesar suggested, right, that this is the effect it's having on these populations, this is what's happening, this is why you need to change it, even, and it depends on what normative work you're trying to do, right? If you're trying to do normative sort of governance work, then it really needs to be based on evidence. If you're doing purely theoretical normative work, then again, that's really important, but it doesn't always affect change because it's much more intellectual. And if you see things like you're working with migrant populations and you're really just trying to make a difference, I think the empirical work just becomes almost heady because it gives you all these tools that you can use and which you can then pass on to, for instance, civil society and UN agencies that are also trying to achieve change. So, I mean, for me especially, I've faced this dilemma many times. You know, what do I focus on and what is really important in this particular area of work often?
Isabella, you're muted. Oh,
yeah, maybe just a quick, Caesar said rightly, you know, this is a complex issue. So I'm going to now just simplify it on, maybe, I hope not to be simplistic, but, you know, to me, normative discourses really are about ideas, about how our societies ought to work, about how the world ought to work. And in the present context that we find ourselves in, it is about alternatives to the status quo. It is alternatives to the present, you know, and this sense that we're caught in these systems and we can't move out of them and we just have to live with them. So, and I think there is a huge, and thank you for that question, you know, I think it's critically important that we foster more of a normative discourse, ideas about a different way in which we as humans, we as our societies ought to work from the continent or the global south, if you like, more broadly. And, you know, I think this is a role that universities, higher education institutions in the global south need to play. And, you know, this needs to encompass both more theoretical, conceptual ideas and discourses, as well as discourses that are informed, that are grounded in, you know, what we can observe empirically. What are people doing? How do people understand, envisage their lives unfolding, their societies unfolding? What are their ideas? I think this is a huge task for us, you know, and it comes back to the question of which research is funded and which research is not funded. I'm not sure we'll get money from I don't know, the major funders might not necessarily support that kind of work, which also speaks to the need for more research investment from the continent or the global south itself. But I think it's a hugely important task that we you know, we need to try and promote as much as we can.
Thank you for those really thoughtful responses. I'm going to come to our very last question. I know there's a couple of questions in there in the chat at the moment that I think we've partially answered, that would have been covered particularly in this response just now. But some of these questions, Matimba and Harleen and Kumeri will follow up these unanswered emails, questions via an email. So our very last question to the panelists. So in the discussions, do we think that global bioethics will end up being equitable and fair when it comes to the global south? And what should then these imaginations that we have, the possibilities of a South-South collaboration, or for global South led, run, thought process, knowledges, bioethics, what would that future look like? What should that just future entail? That wasn't a big question at all.
That's a huge question. I'm going to go first before anybody says something terribly profound, and then I won't be able to continue. I think we're just people, right? So whether we're in the global south or the global north, and I think as we've suggested much earlier, it's all about power. So if the power base moves from the global north to the global south, if we if we get sort of lured by this power, and then we think that we have the right answers, and we think that we then lose our humility and we have the right to dictate how everybody else should think and how everybody else should do the things exactly the same way that we do it, then I think nothing will change. I think if we remember, and if we always keep in mind what it feels like to be marginalized, to have a different point of view, to feel the need to be part of a bigger system that just doesn't work for us, then maybe, right, if we keep on remembering where we are today, maybe it then becomes slightly more equitable over.
Well, okay, if I can come in. I'm always intrigued by how we employ adjectives. So, you know, health has to be global health. Development goals have to be sustainable. Bioethics has to be global. And I think the kind of world I envision is when these adjectives no longer are so important. When we start talking about bioethics and we realize that there are many bioethics, but at the end of the day, these bioethics are all about helping us to actually identify what we ought to be doing so that everybody can thrive. That would be the ideal. And it is important really to also to add this, when we talk about unearthing and desilencing and including all these voices, it is not just about, you know, knocking other systems down in order to raise other people up. Otherwise, we're just repeating the same mechanism. What we're trying to say is that the current frameworks that we're using are impoverishing certain people and are actually inadequate to address the complex challenges that we have. And therefore, if we can bring more in, we can actually imagine a different world. So at the end of the day, there's a quotation from one of the Ghanaian literary writers, Amata Edu, who just passed away recently, one of the first feminist writers on the continent, where she says, you know, people will always see in difference a reason to be mean. You know, there is no need for that. And we need to just go beyond that.
Well, I'm not sure I have anything worthy to say after that, Sharon and Caesar. Maybe just, I suppose, to build on, to draw on your points, and to say that it strikes me that what is required is a concerted effort to develop a critique of the current systems of bioethics. Maybe it exists already, you know, and then please ignore what I say. Maybe it exists, but a critique of the current system and frameworks within which we operate, and maybe a critique that is one developed jointly by scholars, thinkers, you know, across different regions of the global south. I don't know if that's utopian to think of something like that, but it seems to me that that would be a really important first step, critiquing and then identifying where are the areas for where further thought, different thought is required, and then go about trying to develop that thought. That's my sense. But, you know, again, I might be speaking to things that people have already done. So, over.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much. Not just for the urging to work towards a utopia and what that might take, but also for that pluriverse that we hope to work our way towards. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much. I think an incredibly germinal, thoughtful, provoking panel. And also thanks very much to Matimba and Harleen and Kumeri for all their hard work on the panel and for the network. So I'm going to hand over to them in the last minute and 30 seconds that they have to tell you about the upcoming events. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a wonderful webinar, and we're really happy. That was our first webinar, so thank you so much to everybody for sticking with us. We know it was a long one, and we will have a lot to send in the follow-up as well, because I know a lot of people have been asking questions about recordings, and there's some comments as well which we will share with the speakers. And we just want to let you know that we'll share our website as well, which has some more upcoming events. Our next webinar will be around digital health, which is close to my heart because I'm a clinical engineer, and it will be insights from industry. And we also have some research projects that are ongoing. One of them is being Black and Brown in bioethics, and it's a study around postgraduates within the UK. And we have a research study, inclusive bioethics, as well as a podcast series, Power and Privilege in Academia, that will be coming out in the next 2 or 3 months. And we'll have an in-person conference next year in Bristol, which will be a hybrid event. So we are really open to any questions, comments, or anything that you guys would like to see, as we're just starting out. But feel free to email us. I think our email address should be there in the chat. I just want to say a massive thank you to Caesar, Isabella, Sharon, and Rishita for an absolutely wonderful webinar. We're really grateful to have had you on here. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.